Good afternoon. Cliff Lipscomb with Greenfield Advisors. And today I'm going to talk about something a little different. I'm going to talk about the difference between real and perceived risks in communities that are proximate to unconventional shale, gas, and oil development activities. This is based on the book that I mentioned yesterday that came out earlier this year. There's some research in there. We're also doing some other research on this topic as it relates to Japan, and that's going to be forthcoming in a book in 2016. I'm not going to go back over what we do as a firm. I talked about a good bit of that yesterday, although I will mention that this presentation is slightly different in that it really focuses more on the community impacts and the property valuation impacts. It's a burgeoning field. There's not a lot of research that has been done on the property value side yet. There are a couple of key research papers and journal articles that have been published. A couple of researchers at Duke, Muhlenbach's in particular has done some work. A gentleman at Ohio State named, his name escapes me, his name is Alan something. I'll think of his name and I'll come back to it later. But anyway, he's also done some research on property value impacts using some really cool difference estimators, triple difference estimators. And I'm certainly happy to talk about those specifics and those nuances of the econometric models separately after the presentation. So let me start by talking about kind of a continuum of concern. This is the way I think about this particular topic. Everything has a distribution. Everything has one extreme or the other. Well, at one extreme, there are folks out there who always talk about how unconventional shale development always causes impacts, always causes negative impacts, either to property values or to water supplies, health problems that are in the immediate vicinity. That's one extreme. I think those situations are limited personally. We've seen some of those extremes in some of the work that we've done, but for the large part, fracking is generally done, as I've seen it, fairly well. The other extreme is that fracking never causes property value impacts, never damages water supplies, and does not cause any health problems at all. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. And so that reality, or that middle ground, if you will, is that it may cause property value declines, especially if there's a contamination event that impacts drinking water. There's some research that suggests that unconventional shale activities do impact water supplies in certain instances. But those instances seem to be isolated. And I'll talk about a couple of those as we move along. So the general takeaway message, the rest of my presentation, is going to really focus on talking about the idea of perceptions, actual perceptions, or actual risks versus perceptions. Talk a little bit about raising awareness and how companies can also play a role in this in shaping perceptions, and then any actions that might be taken to bridge the gap, so to speak, between reality and risk perceptions of folks that live near unconventional shale activities. On the public perception side, how do people usually get their information? They read it. They read blogs. They read newspapers. They look at Twitter feeds. Most people, I think it's safe to say these days, get their news from the internet, from various sources. They talk to community officials. They read the latest on something like Google News. So really the question that comes up is, are the risks and the way that people perceive the risks related to unconventional shale, are they actual or are they perceived? And if so, how does media and how do company officials perpetuate these perceptions? So as a case study, about a year ago, I gave this speech in Scotland, and I want to look at Scotland just briefly as an example. So the Telegraph put out several news articles. I'll start with this one. This one says, fracking possible in Scotland's most populated areas. And this came out, I believe, in the summer of 2014, so we're about a year and a half away from it. The Scottish government had an expert group saying that there were no technical barriers to doing shale gas extraction. However, there are public concerns related to this. This happens anywhere. This happens in the United States. It's happening in Scotland. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. A couple of us were talking about how there's major differences between the U.S. and Western Europe, and it primarily goes back to property rights. That's a concern too. Who owns the land where these activities would occur? Is it private ownership or is it state ownership? That makes a huge difference in establishing the baseline ground rules, if you will, for even debating these topics. So Simon Johnson is the Scottish political editor for The Telegraph, and he's the one who authored this particular article. Some of the contents of the article, an informal poll of real estate agents excuse me, have reported a drop of between 20 and 30% in areas where shale gas may occur. Well, how is that possible in such a short period of time? If there's no actual drilling occurring, what can you lead that to? It's either, some people call it a negative risk perception, quote unquote, a negative risk perception. Other people call it stigma. In fact, just as a quick aside, my firm kind of first coined the term stigma as it's used in real estate values. Our founder was a gentleman named Bill Mundy, who published some research on this back in as late as the early 1990s on the use of stigma as a legal and as an economic term to describe situations where property values change, in particular decrease, but there's no actual contamination in an area. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Love Canal area of New York. Love Canal was a situation where the Hooker Chemical Company had a large chemical pit where it disposed of chemicals over time. This was back it started in the early 1900s. And then what happened is the land got filled in, and then an entire neighborhood was built on top of this. So it was no surprise in the 1970s and 1980s, children were being born with birth defects and all kinds of things because of a situation like that. So that leads us to a whole discussion of stigma, and I would like to think of it as more of a negative risk perception. That's something that a fracking company has to overcome when it's doing its job. And then later on in the article, Mr. Johnson is talking about how again, the panel of experts said it was unlikely that Scotland could benefit to the same degree as the U.S., but there could be a number of positive impacts. Those positive impacts are definitely jobs and dollars. Okay, so what happened, other things to consider about Scotland in this case study: housing shortages. Are they going to be permanent or temporary, depending on the degree to which fracking is adopted? Education and job training that must occur in the area to educate those folks and get them ready to work on these wells, on these sites. There's certainly a rural to industrial adaptation that has to occur. If you've ever been to Scotland, it's generally very rural. And so where these sites are going, the same thing happens here in the U.S. as well, but where these sites are located, the workforce generally is not skilled in operating that kind of machinery, that kind of equipment, and so there has to be a lot of training. The alternative is to do what's happened here in the United States, and you import the labor from areas such as Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana, where workers are already skilled in operating that particular equipment, and so you have sort of a spatial mismatch of labor that occurs here in the United States. People generally work on wells for a couple of weeks, and then they go home for a week, back for a couple of weeks, back home for a week. That process or that cycle happens a lot more regularly than you might imagine here in this country. And so in this case study of Scotland, one of the issues that would have to be worked out is how do you train that workforce to operate that equipment, or do you go the way of the U.S. and you import the right skilled labor to operate the equipment necessary to perform unconventional shale development? And then there's also a potential out-migration within certain industries as well, in particular agriculture. So the other thing that can be done is to raise awareness. You can reach out to local news organizations for information. You can be a lot more transparent in how you put up signs, and how do you get your plans. What you're going to do with the land, how long you're going to be there, and all that stuff, you can get that out ahead of time to curb these negative risk perceptions that can occur. Obviously, you've got to have communications folks. That's why we have mass communications degrees, at least here in the United States. We got to have people prepared to answer questions and to really be that conduit between the industry, the technical side of what's going on, and making sure that the public is aware of what is going on and, more importantly, what is not going on. There's certainly some discrepancies always between what's going on and how the public perceives what is going on. Wall Street Journal, the U.S. edition, April of last year, had a nice article about Exxon agreeing to publicly disclose more details on the risks associated with its unconventional shale oil and gas wells. And I think we're starting to see more of that, at least in this country, as if you've been following the news media, there's a lot more disclosure of what fluids are being used in the various fracking processes. I was on a fracking well, I think I might have mentioned yesterday, I was on a fracking well about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and the mud that was being used on that particular site was actually it was a diesel base. And so there's diesel being pumped down as part of the mud to get the initial piping set up. So on this slide, I'm talking about taking action, and what I mean here is, in following safety guidelines, and this kind of relates to what companies can do to offset that negative risk perception that generally exists when a new industry moves to town. It's unfamiliar, and that lack of familiarity usually fosters negative risk perceptions. Following safety guidelines, I'm thinking of things like sediment fences. There's down at the bottom, I've got exhaust silencers, sound curtains, things that can be done to mitigate the negatives that come off of these sites. Reminding employees how important community buy-in is, of really being a good citizen, making sure that any issues are dealt with immediately. The site I was on a couple of weeks ago did a really interesting thing. I'd never seen this before. There were multiple, in management consulting, there's a term called a single point of failure, an SPOF. And so if there's a single point of failure, you want to have multiple backup systems. And so this particular site had multiple berms. So if there was a spill in the middle of the site of, let's say, diesel, there was a lined pit, maybe, 15 feet in width, if you will. Well, then there was another one, another 15 feet out, and another 15 feet out. And so there were three or four built-in backup systems, I suppose, in the event of a failure, in the event of a contamination event, so that it didn't run down the hill and get into some of the surrounding areas. So they really were doing a nice job of making sure that if there was an event, that it would be handled appropriately. Truck traffic is another one. Driving through rural Pennsylvania a couple of weeks ago, trucks everywhere, and they're carrying fresh water, they're carrying wastewater away to other states to put into injection wells. There's the massive 18-wheelers, 10, 20 a day coming in with the pipes to actually drill that initial well. So there's a decent amount of truck traffic. And in fact, it was interesting, there was a no truck zone when the school buses run in the morning and the afternoon. So 18-wheelers with these pipes can't come into the area between like 8 and 8:30, 7:30 and 8 o'clock in the morning, and then again at 2:30 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because of the plethora of buses that come through the area. So I thought it was an interesting kind of trade-off between the industry's needs and making sure that they maintain the safety of the children on the buses in particular in that very rural area. Despite best intentions, there can be issues, as we all know. I mentioned the Parr versus Aruba Petroleum case here in the first bullet point, only because we worked on behalf of the Parr family in that case. The Parr family is a relatively unusual situation. They had a 40-acre farm outside of Dallas, Texas. There was a very large, from my understanding, there's a very large density of wells in close proximity to that house. And all the deer died, the turkey died, the family got nosebleeds and headaches that they had never experienced before. So it's one of those cases where a large density of wells in a very tight area, in a very tight proximity, led to some health effects. Well, health effects also impact the real estate, which is where we came in. If you can't live on the property due to the environment at the site, that impacts what's called the highest and best use of the property. It also impacts the interests that a person or a family has in their property, the right to quiet enjoyment, the right to use your property in any way that's legally permissible, etc. And so the Parr family litigated against the companies in the area, and they got a fairly favorable outcome. Despite best intentions, other issues such as noise, other disamenities, truck traffic I've already mentioned, and then wastewater disposal can also crop up. When things go wrong, what do we typically see? We see public outcry, we see things in the media, we see documentaries come out. If you're not familiar with them in this country, we've had several documentaries. Gasland is one of them. Gasland 2 came out not too long ago. There have been others as well. Matt Damon, who is a famous U.S. actor, made a movie about the fracking industry. The name escapes me, but you ought to check it out. It's a fairly interesting take on kind of the politics behind unconventional shale. There can be noise issues, and then also, as I've mentioned, possible health effects. Real quick, the fallout from all of this, you can go one extreme and you can ban fracking altogether. New York has done so. Pennsylvania has some limited moratoriums on new wells. That's already passed. Hawaii, Ohio, New Mexico, and there are others battling bans. Probably the most interesting is what's been happening in Texas in the last year. A community in Texas decided to ban fracking, and then the state of Texas came in and said, your ban on fracking is banned. And so it's an interesting dynamic what's going on there between local control and local jurisdictions wanting to have the ultimate say-so in what happens to their community. However, states sometimes step in and say, no, that's not going to work. We're going to prescribe policy for you. I've already mentioned Parr v. Aruba Petroleum. I've already mentioned the case in Texas. A quick related point is there seem to be a lot of natural gas pipeline failures that seem to be occurring in the United States. And the question that has to be asked is this because of this increased supply of natural gas that's being produced, or is it just an old infrastructure issue? I think it's common knowledge that the U.S. has a lot of infrastructure problems, roads, bridges, and that also extends to pipelines. It's just infrastructure that needs to be upgraded. We're trying to do that kind of thing by infrastructure bonds and whatnot, but not to the degree that we need to yet. I'll kind of end with this since I'm at the end of my time. There's been some recent research on the relationship between unconventional shale and earthquake activity and seismic activity. I've seen some research come out of Britain. There's been a decent amount of research coming out of from officials in Oklahoma, from researchers in Oklahoma. I mentioned the Muhlenbach study from 2012 on how being close to a fracking well in Pennsylvania relates to property values. There's a distance issue there that has not been completely vetted yet. How far away is too far away, or how close is too close, to shape the question a little differently. And then at the end of the day, you've got this struggle, this tension, if you will, between being too close to a site and how that would impact property values, balanced against the jobs and the dollars that are created from these activities. I'll skip the interesting solution because I think that was a one-time deal, and I'll end with this. Fracking done well is obviously an economic boom for communities. Fracking done poorly, often as we have seen, results in litigation, and so it really behooves the operators and the drillers to up front make sure that all the precautions that need to be taken are taken to prevent these so-called black swan events from happening. Black swans, you know, are low probability events, but that have huge impacts. And so a lot of prevention done today can really save some headache later on. Thank you very much.